Hey guys, and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name is Erica, and it's a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, I am chatting to author Elizabeth Fremantle about her new book, well, her 2023 release. I'm a little late to the party, but it's her most recent book titled Disobedient. Now, before we can go into this, I do just want to let you guys know I'm so late to the party in highlighting Elizabeth Fremantle's work. So I wanted to take a little moment to do that just before I hand it over to Elizabeth to introduce Disobedient to you guys and give us a little bit of an elevator pitch of the book. So Elizabeth is a critically acclaimed author that has actually published 4 historical fiction books. So the first of which is titled The Queen's Gambit, which is soon to be released as a feature film named Firebrand for obvious reasons because of that Netflix series. She's also written The Sisters of Treason, Watch the Lady, and The Girl in the Glass Tower. Now, these are not the only books that Elizabeth has published. She also has 2 historical thrillers, which are published under a slightly different name, which is E.C. Fremantle. And those books include The Poison Bed and The Honey and the Sting. But as I said, we're here to discuss Disobedient and the life of Artemisia Gentileschi, which is so exciting because I haven't done anything like this on the channel so far. So actually, let's hand it over to you now, Elizabeth. Can you tell us a little bit about Disobedient, just for those who maybe did read it when it first came out, maybe those who have not heard of it yet, who kind of want to get a little flavor of what they can expect from the pages of this book?
Well, Disobedient tells the story of a year in the life of an extraordinary woman. Artemisia Gentileschi was a painter. It's set in 1611, so it was very unusual to be a woman and be a painter. She's 17 years old, and she's the daughter of a painter, knows she's much more talented than her father, something that it causes a lot of friction. And she is determined to achieve her dream, which is to become one of the great painters. She does, but there are some seriously difficult obstacles that are thrown in her path. So the novel is about how she deals with those obstacles.
So I wanted to actually start with something that you said in another interview. You spoke to History Hit about this book way back before it came out. And you said that it was Artemisia's force of character that drew you into writing this book. Because it wasn't, if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't contracted for you to write this book. This sort of came later.
Not this book. I was actually contracted to write a different book about somebody else. And so, but I wanted to write about Artemisia for quite a long time, but I sort of thought, well, it's set in Italy. It's very different from what I usually do. And I was contracted to write something else. And then it just, the idea, I just built up a force, a head of steam, and I just had to do it. I had to do it. And it was, I mean, the thing about characters from history, we don't really know what they were like, but with Artemisia, you look at her work and you see the rage in it and the beauty of it. And it tells us so much about her as a character, that a young woman, all the work that I discuss in the book, the ones she's painting at the time, she was under 20 years old when she painted these things, really visceral, brutal pictures. And I thought, for a young woman to choose those kind of subjects, no other woman had tackled. Some of them, only one other man had tackled. Only Caravaggio had painted the very, very famous painting, which is Judith slaying Holofernes, which is, 2 women holding a man down and hacking his head off. It's pretty brutal, or very brutal, I should say. And that she had the gall to paint those subjects as a woman shows us something of her force of character. Yeah, so that was what really drew me in initially.
Well, speaking of Caravaggio, he pops up at the start of this book. And so just so that you know, when I went into this book, I knew like nothing about Artemisia because I very much sit in the ancient world. So I had so much fun reading this book because I didn't Google anything about her before. And
Oh,
so I just
great.
kind of got
Yes.
to read
Yeah.
and really enjoy it. And then I was like secretly Googling, like, what do these pieces look like? Like, what are we talking about? And the inclusion of Caravaggio found it really interesting when I was Googling that even though it's not a direct reference in the historical sources that we have, you were actually building off of rumors that Caravaggio at least knew the family. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, we know that Caravaggio and Orazio Gentileschi is Artemisia's father. They knew each other. They were part of the same milieu. They were, I mean, in some accounts they were very good friends. In other accounts they were acquaintances, but they certainly knew each other. And I found a little nugget in a book about, a sort of quite an old book about Rome, and that was talking about Artemisia Gentileschi, and it was talking about the relationship with Caravaggio, and it said that she was taken to this execution of a woman called Beatrice Cenci, and with Caravaggio and her father. And I thought, oh, and I'd written the book by this point. I was doing another draft, and I thought, I've got to put that in because, to me, it made so much sense to kind of show it's the first chapter is her age 6 being taken on Caravaggio's shoulders to see this monstrous event of a young woman being executed, and the impression it has on her, and that impression kind of follows her through the whole novel, really, that impression as a young girl, seeing what had happened to this other young woman. But yeah, so we don't really know if they were all there together at the execution, but I felt it was too tempting a little nugget of information to pass over.
Oh, it was so brilliant. I mean, I loved his inclusion anyways, because I was like, oh, I know him. Like, great. We've kind of
Yeah,
contextualized
yeah,
him for me, who doesn't know. And I'm sure like many people who are watching this wouldn't have known Artemisia, but then heard Caravaggio and are like, oh, great, there's my entry point. But you
yeah.
mentioned her father. And I know that this is probably quite a controversial thing to say, but he was, I think, one of my favorite characters in the book, just because I think you wrote him so brilliantly.
Thank
Like
you.
you did such a great job of writing this really troubled man, but also like I didn't walk away thinking that he was a monster, which I thought was just done brilliantly. So can you tell us a bit more about him?
Yeah. Yeah, well, he's her antagonist, but he isn't a monster, and certainly by the culture of the time, he was behaving in a fairly normal way for a father, very protective, overprotective, we would consider now. She wasn't really allowed out on her own, and as a young woman, as a young virgin, the virginity was to be protected at all costs. A woman's virtue was all she had. And the father's there to protect it, and of course she's so headstrong and talented and different from other girls. She's very difficult to control, and I saw him, I mean, actually, funny you should say that about him, but there's a huge amount of material that I wrote from his perspective that didn't make it into the novel, the final novel. It was really, it was almost like both their stories intertwined. And then, that was the first draft. And out of it, I thought, no, 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 I'm telling her story. And, I needed to cut quite a lot of his story out. But the idea I took from, this idea that you look at the work and you can see the difference from her work to his. He's a wonderfully accomplished painter, but she's got this spark of life in her work that is missing from his. And I just wondered what that must be like for a father to look at his daughter. He must feel so proud and yet really envious, because everyone's looking at her work and thinking that's the work, that's the best stuff, the bits of the painting she's done, those are the things that people point out. And he loves it and he hates it, and it's really difficult for him. And I don't know if you've seen the play or the film of Amadeus.
Oh, I haven't.
Okay, so it's the story of Mozart, but it's from the perspective of his kind of mentor figure who was called Salieri, and he was this very serious court musician and very, very accomplished. And then along comes this kind of rebel Mozart, who's, you know, he's like, well, Salieri kind of describes him as a performing monkey. You know, he's really wild and rude to everyone, and you know, he's just a ridiculous man, but he produces like music from the gods. And Salieri can't reconcile with the fact that God has chosen to give all this talent to this ridiculous man, when he, who's so God-fearing and he's so kind of upright, and he just doesn't have that talent. And so that was my kind of point of entry for Oratio, this idea that God has given all this talent, not to any of his three sons, but to his daughter. It was like a joke from God. And so that was my kind of starting point. I thought, how does he reconcile himself with that? And so that's how his character unfolded.
Yeah, it was done brilliantly. And that's something that I love, I think, because I read so much like Greek mythology. I really like seeing like these just really horrible characters that then they have glimmers of like real humanity in them. And you're like, oh, but I can't hate you because in a sense, I understand where you're coming from, even though I don't
Yeah.
agree. And like you said, the time period is so important for this as well, that even though it's shocking to read, a lot of the things that he says and does, which I won't say so that you guys can enjoy that, but like some things that he does, you just want to scream at him and like drag him and just be like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But also, again, knowing the time period, it's like, I can't expect anything else from you.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, you know, daughters were treated in much the same way daughters were treated in the ancient world, you know, cloistered, not allowed to make their own decisions, and kind of enslaved to the patriarchy. And, you know, it hadn't really changed.
Absolutely. So speaking of the art in this book, there are so many pieces of art that you detail and that you use, but the two main ones that sort of are like the halves of the book are Susanna and the Elders and the Judith piece. So these are just, if you guys haven't looked at them, because I hadn't before reading this book, they are amazing. So I would highly recommend, I'll leave some links in the description below to the pieces so that you can check them out. But I was wondering, because these aren't the only two pieces, obviously, that Artemisia has done. So as the writer, when you were coming into this book and you thought, okay, I really want to write about Artemisia, was it difficult to choose what pieces were going to be included? Or did you always knew you were going to use Susanna and then Judith to kind of bookend it? Or
no, I always knew those were going to be the two pieces. I mean, I knew that she had painted the Susanna when she was really young. And so I knew that that would fit very much, and that she painted the first version of that Judith also at a similar time. So those were her great paintings from that period of her life. So I kind of that kind of fitted with the history, but it also fitted thematically for me, because I felt that in the Susanna, I mean, for the people watching and listening, the Susanna is they're biblical stories, and that when they're not really familiar to us anymore, but Susanna is a naked woman being ogled by two older men, and in a very, very threatening manner. And it had been a topic that painters had always painted, but it was always a little bit that the naked Susanna's a bit kind of, you know, food for oglement from the men, and you know that they're, you know, naked women for men to take pleasure out of looking at, and I felt like Artemisia shifted that, you know, that her Susanna looks so afraid, and so you feel uncomfortable staring at her to look at her, how beautiful she is, because you know that she's afraid, and she's being, you know, she's in a situation of victimhood. and it makes you feel really uncomfortable. And that's Artemisia. She's shifting the gaze from the male gaze to the subject, the gaze of the female subject. We see it from her perspective. And this was totally revolutionary. And in a sense, that is at the beginning of the novel, that's Artemisia. She's in this situation where she's being treated in a certain way by men and has no choice or no way out of that kind of treatment. And then by the end of the novel, she is this kind of, muscular, domineering woman who makes her own decisions, who, in the Judith, I mean, she is literally beheading a man. And, so it's like where she goes from victim to survivor. And, and there's I see an element of revenge in that picture. I mean, it's always art historians discuss it greatly, whether it's a picture that depicts some of her autobiography or not. I see it as depicting some of her autobiography. But, art historians they don't want to see her work in those terms, because they see that as her work having been shaped by the acts of men. I see it, on the contrary, as she's taken the acts of men and shaped that experience into her own work. She's taken it and made it her own. But that's a matter for debate. But that's how I saw it. So that's the story from Susanna to Judith. That's her story.
We'll use the word survivor then. Before we can get to that part of the book, there is a through thread as you tell this story of, and this is how I managed to connect it all, guys, was because of Ovid. You have
Yes.
this gorgeous allusion to Ovid that is throughout, and you use this nightingale throughout
Yes.
the story. And like this little nightingale pops up, or like the song of the nightingale. And it's just this beautiful, subtle, like little nod throughout it. So before we can get into what exactly that is, when was the first time you encountered Ovid and the stories of him in ancient Rome?
Okay, well, a long time ago, I discovered, when I was studying The Wasteland, the T.S. Eliot poem, I learned about Philomel and Procne. And because it's there, it's there in The Wasteland. They have Philomel's voice, and they have the sound of the song of the nightingale. And, it's very loosely alluded to, but I did quite a kind of close study of the poem and looked at all the allusions, and there came to that particular story from Ovid. And actually, anyone who's read all my work, it's in maybe 50% of the novels I've written, because it says so much about early modern women and their silencing. I mean, I'm sure most of the people who subscribe to your podcast are familiar with that story, but I give you a brief outline just in case not. Is Philomel and Procne are sisters. Along comes a kind of, prince of another kingdom called Tereus, and he marries Procne and takes her back to his country. Philomel misses her sister desperately. So Tereus comes back to fetch her, to bring her back so she can visit. But instead of bringing her back so she can visit her beloved sister, he rapes her. And she says, I'm going to tell everybody what you've done. And he cuts out her tongue. Typically brutal in all those stories of Ovid. There's such a darkness behind them, but I think this is a particularly dark one. He cuts out her tongue and then holds her up in like a place in the forest she can't escape from. But she's determined to make the story known to the world, and so she embroiders her story onto a loom, which is this kind of wonderful symbol of the tools of the woman. The loom is just, it's like the domestic space. It speaks of the female, and she uses it. And then when Procne finds her, she can tell her. And then Procne is so furious, she kills her son, and in true ancient style, feeds him to his father. And then they are, you know, the father's all furious, he's going to kill them all, and then they're transformed into birds, and Philomela is transformed into the nightingale. Yes. Oh, whenever I recount that story, I think, God.
But there's also so brilliant. I mean, especially that
Yeah.
one, I found that so many people are coming to that story more now, which I'm
Yeah.
really thankful
Yeah.
for, because I think it's such a brilliant example of, I mean, not only literal silencing, but also just struggle and communication and all of
Mm-hmm.
these really dark topics that
Yeah. Yeah.
women obviously had to face at the time, and still obviously, you know, the Me Too movement and all of that.
Yeah.
And something that I really particularly loved about your book is not only the inclusion of Procne and Philomela, but also you have so many nods to other ancient women who have also dealt with the same stuff that Artemisia has to deal with. Like on page 197, you allude to Medusa as well, and how
Yeah.
Artemisia has coily hair like Medusa. And her father's looking at her at the time and is like, can you seriously not have cleaned up a little bit? Which is unfortunate given what's happened right before that. But I was wondering, you know, with all of these gorgeous illusions, were these just really natural for you, like as you were writing that they came in, or did you know sort of before you started writing, here are all of the characters that I'm going to include as nods?
No, it's a much more organic process, really. I mean, I knew I wanted to, it was one of the ways I wanted to structure the book was on stories from Ovid, because I felt, you know, I always feel when you're writing about people in the early modern period, what were they reading? They were reading those books. That was what they were painting. It was biblical, or it was, I mean, primarily Ovid in Rome at that period. They were all doing paintings of, if you look, not in Rome, but in Venice, Titian, a little bit earlier than that, maybe 50 years before, he did the whole cycle of the Ovid stories, which were at the National Gallery a few years ago. I don't know if you saw it.
I
Just
didn't.
amazing.
Killed me.
Yes. And I'm always really intrigued by the way those stories are reflected through the stories I want to tell to today. And as you mentioned, the Me Too movement, I think of it so much. You know, this Disobedient is kind of my Me Too novel, because it talks about a woman who's a survivor. But, you know, and I wanted to kind of, in a way, through those stories from Ovid, show that there's anybody's story of survival now, and I dedicate the book to all the survivors. Any story of survival now is the same story of survival from that period, from the ancient world, from right the way through history. It's the same story. We're still telling it. And, you know, that was the point I wanted to make with the book. So somehow all those illusions, because I'm so fond of all those ancient texts, they all find their way in, you know. So, you know, curly hair is always going to be like Medusa, you know, it just comes very naturally to me. Yeah, and funnily, you should mention Medusa, because the book I'm just writing now has a whole Medusa theme. And it's about another woman in Italy at this similar period. But it's, again, I've gone right back to Ovid again, and lots about Diana and about Medusa. And I always want to, you know, I want to draw parallels between all the different pasts of history, and they layer up. And things, it's like a kind of spiral, isn't it? Things repeat slightly differently through history, and I always want to convey that in my novels. And so obviously the ancient texts are a good place to start in a way. And actually with Ovid, for this book, I had much more of it, but my editor said, look, it's very distracting. You know,
Really?
we need to pare this down. And I had all these quotes and everything. And of course, the quotes, you know, for people who really know and know the quotes, then they are meaningful. But so many people, I mean, don't know the quotes, you know, that it could be, I think she felt, my editor, and rightly felt, that it might make people feel that they weren't understanding something.
Mm.
And I get that. And in a way, you know, the book has to stand up on its own without the quotes. But I'm so glad that you see all those threads of Ovid that are still there, because, you know, they form such an important part of the story for me. But you don't have to know Ovid to appreciate the story. That's, I think, the point.
Well, that's something I think was done so beautifully is that you don't need to know them. Like, yes, you have the Nightingale. Yes, you have like little Medusa quotes and lots of other quotes that I have like written down that allude to the ancient world. We won't go through all of them, don't worry.
Yeah.
But there are so many of them that I was like, here are these like little gems, but they're not in your face. Like, they're not like, if you don't know this myth, you're missing out on a whole thing. Like, it's
Yeah.
very much a description and then a move on. But I'm like,
Yeah.
that works really well with this scene, or whatever it was, which is so
The big
gorgeous.
one in this is the hermaphrodite.
I wanted to get to this. So the statue is obviously like the
Yeah.
big thing
Yeah.
at the start of it.
Mm.
So let's unpack that. Where did that come into the story for you? And why was that important for you to include?
Okay, so I'd seen the statue. There's one in the Louvre, and it's an ancient statue on a modern couch, and it's just the most beautiful thing. And I thought one day that's got to go into a book, and it was quite a few years ago I saw it. Maybe as many as 10 years ago, actually. But I had it there in my memory bank. That's got to go in. That's got to go in. Because I thought it's such a great way of symbolizing the woman who behaves like a man in the world. And that's Artemisia. She wants to have a man's privilege, and she takes it. She doesn't just moan about the fact she hasn't got it. She takes it for herself. And I thought that, in a sense, she's sort of obsessed with this figure of the hermaphrodite. She really, really wants to see the statue, which is the Cardinal Borghese has it in his locked closet because it's a very controversial piece. And but she wants to see it. She wants to draw it. She wants to know it and understand it. And she wants to understand the male world and the world that's hidden to her. So it was a great way of symbolizing not only her and how she is, but what she wants to see and experience.
Well, she is such a strong and powerful character throughout. Like, despite everything that happens to her, like, she's so inspiring to read in your novel, which obviously is historical fiction, but she's just so strong no matter what. And I'm not going to ruin it, guys, I swear. But when we get to a historical point in her story where she has to go to a trial, and there are historical records of this, aren't there?
I mean, a lot of my research was taken from the transcripts from the trial.
Right. So when she goes and she has to testify in trial, she's got to, I don't want to ruin it. We're just going to say she's going to sit there. I thought a lot of this, because again, I didn't know anything going into this.
Yeah.
I thought, okay, this is where the author has really had fun. And she's gone to town, she's gone fictional. And then I Googled it.
Yeah.
Turns out not the case.
Yeah.
So as an author, because this is horrible to read, like I literally was covering my face as I was reading your book. How did you feel tackling that? And like, just because I think it's such a horrible thing to have to read, but also to have to rewrite. What was that like for you?
That's a really interesting question, because it is, there are two huge events in the book which are, basically involve the brutalizing of the female body in different ways. And I am also a survivor of a similar experience. And so for me, I think I wanted to write this book for a long time, but I didn't feel I had the emotional capacity to do it until a certain point. And I think it was after the Me Too movement and women starting to really come out and talk about their experiences in public that I managed to kind of shed the shame attached to that experience from my youth. But it was a sort of sense that there was a moment I just thought, I can do this. And there is actually a lot of the women in my books have to overcome really huge obstacles. And there is a sense of that I kind of take a step aside and I kind of sit to one side of myself and I write it. And it's not, rather than it being difficult, it's really a catharsis, actually. That I can somehow express any kind of pent up rage or sense of injustice, or that it can all come out onto the page. So rather than it being difficult, it's actually something a really, really positive emotional journey, I guess, to get it onto the page. And yeah, well, that's how I felt afterwards. It was certainly, the whole novel has been really cathartic for me.
Well, there was something as well that you had said in another podcast, similar to what you just said, but you said that also that was sort of your touch point with Artemisia as she was painting, that she had to go through, obviously, and become a survivor. I think becoming a survivor is a good way of putting it, because you don't really get a choice in any of that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
she's kind of forced to do that, but then she's painting these horrible scenes. Whereas in that interview, you said, by the time she gets to that, there's that sense of like, it's out and I'm getting it out there and I'm pushing it out. So would you still say that was your touch point with the character?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, it's for me, the relationship between her story and particularly that Judith painting is so clear. I can't unsee that, that there's no doubt to me that she is expressing all that rage and all that revenge through this painting. And, and that, I wanted to convey that to the world and to other women and people who have been through similar experiences, that it doesn't have to crush you. It can make you really strong. And in the way that, that she was made strong by that experience. She was strong anyway, but that experience really turned her, into the unbelievably determined woman she eventually was. And she lived an extraordinary life after the novel as well. I don't know if you looked a bit up. I looked up her subsequent life. She was the first woman to be admitted to the Academy of Arts in Florence. And she was a really celebrated painter in her day. Alas, through history, she became, because of being female, she kind of became discredited. The Baroque art fell out of fashion, and then she was never kind of rehabilitated into fashion as some of the others were, like Caravaggio. But I believe it's a great injustice to her that she's not equally a household name, and I want her to be. And so this book's a little, hopefully helping that journey to make her as well known as her peers as she was in her day. But she lived a kind of libertine lifestyle. There are lots of letters from her subsequent life. She had children with Pier Antonio Stiatesi, and but it seems to have been a kind of marriage of friendship or convenience, because she had a lover for many, many years who was friendly with and corresponded with her husband. And I thought, well, that's really very bold for a woman of that period to live that kind of lifestyle, and quite openly. So I took a lot of that as well, that she was really a woman of courage.
I wanted to ask you about Piero, actually, because he was such a great character throughout, but you've said that he was one of the ones that you had to fictionalize the most from these letters.
Yeah, because we know so little about him. And also, even in her story, when other people tell it, he's kind of brushed aside. It's like nobody's really interested in him. And I really, really wanted her to have a central friendship that was totally pure. And in a way, what they have is, so Piero is homosexual. And of course, I have no idea, I made that up. But there are certain, I didn't make it up out of nothing. Mm-hmm. There are little things that led me to believe I could characterize them in that way, that it made sense, certainly to me, little things from their biography. But I wanted this relationship that was not kind of sullied by anything romantic or sexual, that it's incredibly pure, and it's about her art, and it's about his freedom to be who he is. And they both are able to give that to each other So yeah, that's where he sprung from, and I'm glad you like him because he's one of my favorites too.
He was just, I think, because she's surrounded by just such an awful world for the position that she's in.
Yeah.
To have Piero show up, and when he's not there, I'm like, come on, come on, like she needs you
Yes.
right now.
When are you coming back?
But I also thought, a character that I guess I struggled with her, but I also really liked her was Zita. And
Yeah.
she's also, I mean, that's not her historical name.
No, it's not. Tutsia is her real name, but it was there was some discrepancy. Some of the early readers said, "Oh, you've got Tassie and Tutsia, and they were confusing. It's confusing." So I thought, well, I'll just give her a name that's completely different. I thought Zita could be a nickname of Tutsia. Yeah, she's a really interesting figure, and she's very, very interesting from the court transcripts and from the story itself. So a lot of her is as she was, or a version of as she was. There are, I've drawn a lot of kind of historical parallels that are, well, I hesitate to use the word truth because we have no idea. But so she's true to a point, true to the history. And she's an interesting figure because I wanted to kind of show Artemisia up against another woman who was more conventional to her time.
Mm-hmm.
And she has, tough old time of it, poor Zita. And she always thinks she's doing the right thing and, ends up doing disastrous things. And she tries to be pious, but she's a little bit of a kleptomaniac, can't quite help herself. And, and she's not super bright, but she's got a heart. And she does suffer for the things she does. She doesn't get an easy ride of it. Mm.
Certainly not. But I'm noticing the time, so I did want to go through one quote with you that I just think I don't want to leave this without mentioning this. Because, so for people who don't know, who don't have the book, this is split up into parts. And at the start of each part, there's a quote. And at the opening of part 2, the quote is from Artemisia herself. And it's, "You will find the spirit of Caesar in the soul of a woman."
Yeah.
So I was wondering, one, where that's from, and two, what do you think she meant by that?
Well, she's talking about herself, and it's from a letter. It's from one of her letters, and actually, all the quotes are all from her. The quotes are for the 3 parts, but that one, yeah, she is trying to convince. She's trying to convince someone that she's got the courage to fulfill the commission she's being asked to fulfill, and she says, just you wait. You'll see. I've got the spirit of Caesar in the soul of a woman. And so it's kind of, I think it's a wonderful illusion, that she backs herself. And I love that. I love that she really believes in herself, and she believes in her strength and her spirit. And she has the courage to say that about herself. Yeah.
So I did want to talk about the Artemisia exhibition. I didn't go to it here in London, but I know that you did. And
Yeah.
obviously writing this book,
Yeah.
you're using her artwork. And I was just wondering, for us, people who are watching as well, who haven't seen her work, what is that like to actually see the work of this woman on display with all of her other pieces? Like, what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing. And it was so sad because it was in 2020 and it was firstly postponed. It was meant to be coming in the spring of 2020. It was postponed because of COVID. And then when it did open, however many people were allowed in at once. And I mean, we all remember what that was like. And it's so sad because I felt that was a moment for people to really engage with her body of work, because there's a lot of work and there are things being found still, things being reattributed to her. There was a painting recently from the Royal Collection that nobody really realized it was hers, and it was restored and they have now reattributed it to her. Only that was, the end of last year that was announced. And then a couple of her paintings turned up. There was a big explosion in Lebanon a few years ago, and 2 of her paintings were damaged. They're being restored, but they were rediscovered. They would, I don't know, in some warehouse or something. So her work is now appearing in places we didn't really expect to find it. So that's exciting. But for all her work to be seen together, because, you can see there's one of the Judiths in the Uffizi and the others in Naples, and then they're scattered around the world. And there's the self-portrait, which is in the Royal Collection, I think. And then, and there's another self-portrait of St. Catherine in the National Gallery. But to walk into those exhibition halls and see all that work together, I mean, my mind was absolutely blown. I can't begin to explain what it felt like, because I was writing the novel at that time. And to just go, and I just felt like she was talking to me and to us in that exhibition space. And to see the highlight was to see the two versions of Judith hung side by side. And you just see the kind of progress from one to the other. I mean, they're both really powerful, but the second one has just got, is so much more brutal, and the women are so much more kind of, there's a sort of determination, but a kind of sense of detachment. But that's really, I mean, they're just totally beguiling, these pieces. Yeah, I mean, it was an incredible experience. And I wish for the next one, I wish to see more of her stuff hung like that together. I don't know if there's a thing coming at the Tate of women's art from the 1500s to the 1900s. I'm not sure until when, but I'm hoping they'll have a few of hers in that. It's coming really soon in the spring. So yeah, women's art, women masters or something like that. It's yeah, there should, if there isn't any of her, I shall stand with a placard outside demanding why not.
So did seeing her pieces change anything for you? Because obviously, when you see them online or you see them printed in a book, they are still powerful. But to see, I always, whenever I talk to people about this, I always think like of the first time I saw the Mona Lisa. Like you have this like really like grand idea of what it is, and then you see it and you're like, it's so delicate. It's so fragile and beautiful, but it changes, the expectation kind of changes as well, how you interact with the piece. So for you, because you were writing this book, did you have an idea and then you saw the pieces, and did it change at all or solidify?
I think, I mean, there were some ideas that sprung out of seeing the work directly. And I think there were some early pictures of Orazio's with hers. And I really got the sense of how different they were as painters from that. Because if you look at them in reproductions, you can see it, but seeing them, it's really, really apparent, what her strengths are, and, what his weaknesses are against her strengths. And, I'm not saying that he's not a brilliant painter, but that was very writ large for me in that exhibition. And the other thing was, I think particularly, I'd wanted to use the Susanna and the Judith to kind of bookend the novel, but when I saw them in the life, I really saw how, there was something in the Susanna, the brushwork and everything. It's so careful and beautifully rendered, and kind of there's a timidity to it, a beautiful timidity that by the second Judith, it's like it's strident, and there's a real boldness to the style of it and the style of painting. And there's even one thing that I hadn't noticed, which was, I felt it was like a revelation, is that there are spats of blood in the painting, and it looks like she's taken the brush and flicked it on. And I was discussing this with Philip Mould, an art historian who you might know from the BBC, Fake or Fortune. And I met him somewhere, and we were talking kind of madly, having a mad conversation about Artemisia, all really passionate on my part anyway. And he said he thinks that it's the first instance of a painter flicking the paint onto a canvas. So that was a really, it's a moment. And that was something, to see that in the flesh was really, really an extraordinary thing. And to kind of understand the place of that in the history of art, it's really important.
Yeah, the innovation of that is
Yeah.
crazy.
And the sense of her coming from the kind of the tight precision of the Susanna to get to this point where she feels free enough to do that, to kind of just spat the paint and see where it lands, to create the actual effect of a blood spat. Yeah.
Yeah, and even when I was looking at the pieces online, I noticed like how much actually just darker the painting became from the first to the second. Like the first one, there's still like light streaming through, and like you can kind of see more so like the colors of the dresses and all of this. And I was like, oh, okay, that's dark, but like it's daylight or whatever. And the second Judith was so dark. Like it's just like there was no hiding in that piece at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean they're powerful. They're powerful paintings. If anyone gets the chance to go and see them, as I said, one's in the Uffizi and one's in it's the big gallery in Naples. I can't remember what it's called now, but yeah, they're really worth seeing. So if anyone's in Italy going to look at Roman ruins, take a little trip to see the Artemisias as well. I really recommend them.
I didn't know one was down in Naples. I'm going to be going this summer, so I'm definitely adding that to my list now.
Yes.
How exciting.
I think it's the Capamonti Gallery, something like that. It's easy to find out where it is. Yeah.
I'll add it to the description below, guys. Don't you worry. And we'll make this as easy as possible for everyone. But I like to end these interviews on a piece of advice. And you are, I mean, like one of the queens of historical fiction in my eyes, and I think a lot of readers' eyes. So I have a lot of, people who are aspiring to be authors who watch these interviews. And because you do historical fiction so well, I was wondering if there's something that you learned along the way that you think would have made your journey a lot easier had you just known it from the start, that you could offer as advice to anybody who's watching.
Okay. It is to not allow yourself to get too bogged down in the things you know from your research. Let the story really breathe. You can always come back and kind of tie things up in a slightly more accurate way, but let the fictional story take its path initially, to just so even if you know incredibly fascinating details, if they don't fit in the fiction, don't try and fit them in. Just let the story be what it wants to be. Yeah, I know that sounds all a bit vague and airy-fairy, but hopefully it kind of it will resonate with some people.
That's actually a great piece of advice to end on. It's so simple, but so vital and important. So thank you so much for sharing that, not only with me, but also with my audience. And thank you guys, as I say at the end of all of these episodes, for sitting down and for continuing to watch and support the channel. It means the world to me. It goes without saying, you guys can find the links to Disobedient in the description below if you guys want to read it yourself. And of course, I have listed Elizabeth Fremantle's socials in case you guys want to be in the know first and foremost anytime she comes out with new work or exciting new announcements. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on MoAn Inc. So I'll see you guys then.